Alright, ladies and gents, we have a first look at Elden Ring, and my god, it is absolutely glorious. And yeah, we were expecting Elden Ring to not disappoint. Well, this was actually that, but on steroids, and everything that I thought I would be concerned about the game is pretty much put to rest. It has a massive open world, tons of open world activities, a lot of dungeons you can jump into seamlessly, and of course, cool new skills and abilities that we will check in this video. And boss fights, because what is Dark Souls, sorry, Elden Ring without boss fights? So let's check that in this video. And yes, I take full responsibility for that Dark Souls joke. I must not be the only one that got some major Dark Souls vibes from the game, but even more so, it seems that this is the embodiment of everything that made that series great, and now all wrapped up into a nice open world package. And yeah, the open world in Elden Ring is absolutely massive. We only saw about a couple of regions out of the 6 total that we will have in the game when it launches, and it already looked absolutely massive. Here's a first look at the map in Elden Ring, and only a couple of zones being shown that already seem pretty big. Of course, it gives you a whole bunch of means to mark down points of interest or other areas that you might want to revisit, or maybe something that you have left for later on. There's markers in there to set up points of interest for you to explore later. Of course, you will unlock more of the map as you get more map fragments from what it seems, but we don't really have a clarification on how you will find map fragments in the game when it launches. At the same time, you can also place beacons that will help you a ton with the exploration, because it seems you're going to be doing quite a ton of that. Yeah, and it seems that From Software has put a ton of effort into making traversal and exploration very smooth and seamless. I mean, look at this horse summoning animation right here. Tell me that doesn't look smooth as heck. And that's pretty much not the only thing that you're gonna be doing, because there's also some other skills in there that will help you even more with exploration, especially vertically, because you have a double jump for your horse, which will definitely come in handy, and also something called Spirit Springs that can be used to launch yourself very high up into the air and reach some of those higher up places. And you will definitely want to do that because there's tons of points of interest on the map, as I've said, and we've seen quite a few of these hinted in the gameplay reveal. Of course, we saw some enemy caravans going on there, and pretty much like probably having their own routes on the map. It definitely reminds me a little bit of Ghost of Tsushima, but on a really more scary scale. Like, we saw some of those 2 big brutes carrying what seems to be a very important carriage that will likely have a cool reward on it. At the same time, we also saw enemy camps that, just like in the case of the caravans, are pretty much overrun with enemies that you have to take down, but it will all be worth it because there's a cool reward waiting for you right there at the end. A really big chest that will likely include some nice goodies to further progress with your character. Maybe some gear, weapons, spells, or just materials to craft and do all of that kind of stuff. We also saw what seemed to be random events that can happen out in the wild. One of them included helping this character called Iron Fist, and it seems to have its own dialogues. It seems to be kind of like those smaller missions or events and encounters that kind of remind me a bit of the ones in Red Dead Redemption 2, but we don't really know exactly what happens after this scene ends. We also saw enemy encounters, including this boss fight. There's multiple boss fights that you can find out in the wild, not just in like the missions or the story or the dungeons in the game that we will talk about in just a little bit, but also out randomly in the wild, including this really cool dragon boss fight right here. It definitely seems to be the From Software kind of formula. You have to fight these really big boss encounters. They're super hard, super difficult, but so rewarding if you pull them just right. And there's also some really nice indicators over there that I really appreciated. Like, at some point the boss falls onto the ground, its eyes light up, and it seems to be some kind of gameplay indicator that is a weak spot that you need to attack in order to disable partially the enemy and deal massive damage to it at the very least. Now, of course, we also have to talk about the combat, and combat is pretty much Dark Souls, if I were to be honest with you. It's just as visceral, as heavy, and as skill-based, but also rewarding as ever. It's probably not going to be as prohibiting as the Dark Souls series was. I am expecting it to be a little bit more on the Bloodborne level, simply because in some of these combat scenes I've noticed that it takes way too many hits for the player to go down, so it's probably not gonna be that yeah, punishing as it was in Dark Souls 2 and 3, for example. But I might be mistaken, maybe this is just a character that's been heavily leveled up and has a ton of gear going on for it that resists a ton of the incoming damage. But there's a few cool abilities in there that we've noticed. One of them is the Spirit Summoning, which seems to be a totally new type of ability. You can summon them in battle, especially when you're being overrun by enemies. You can call upon multiple types of spirits, and it seems that there's multiple types in the game that you can collect and use, and maybe even form your own group of spirits that you will want to use in combat for different purposes. We also saw a few magic type abilities, like we have a first look at what seems to be a sorcerer slash cleric kind of build, and I'm not gonna lie, I am really liking the visual effects on some of these spells, especially this one right here that kind of showers the enemy with some damage ability. But we did see a pretty interesting new one that I'm not sure any Dark Souls game featured before, which is the Dragon Breath that this second player uses in one of these co-op scenes right here. So this could be very well one of those spells that you can unlock from completing some of the dungeons in the game. We do know that some of the dungeons in Elden Ring will provide some really cool spells that you will want to equip and, you know, just like have something cool going on for your build and whatnot. Now, speaking of builds, let's also talk about some of the stats changes and, most important, the crafting that has been added in Elden Ring, because you pretty much have a fully fledged crafting system right now in the game that will give you the possibility to craft a whole bunch of items. From what we've seen so far, it's mostly related to consumables. So you can craft stuff like knives and arrows using animal parts that you will likely find by taking down these creatures that you find randomly out in the wild, and even add rare regions on top to create something like sleeping arrows, like in this example right here. And of course, the final screen will show you the summary and will give you control over the output of the items that you craft. But you can see the effects of that sleep bone arrow in the next scene. You can pretty much use that to put enemies to sleep, which will leave them completely exposed to backstab damage, which will deal heavy damage to the enemy and likely one-shot most of them. Now, in terms of stats, these seem to be pretty much almost the same as they were in the Soul series. You still have the level right there at the top, which in this case was 23. Also, Rune's Health is a likely replacement to the Soul's Health, the ones that you use and also lose upon death, so you will need to use a resting place to save your progress or a part of it. In the case of Elden Ring, you don't use bonfires anymore, but you use something called a Site of Grace, which will save some of your progress, will rest your character, but unlike Dark Souls, it can also have additional benefits, including showing you a guiding light, which will indicate nearby points of interest, so it also has an additional use. Also, Vigor is your HP, similar in scaling to Dark Souls 3 from what I'm seeing. A Mind is likely formerly Attunement from the Dark Souls, so it's likely the spell slot. We also have two memory slots there at the bottom, so I think that these two right here, the Mind and the Memory, are kind of connected to one another. Now, for the major stats, the Strength, Dexterity, Intelligence, and Faith, these are exactly the same as they were in the Dark Souls games. We also have Arcane, which seems to be a new stat, but this could replace the Luck stat from Dark Souls because it seems to be tied to the item discovery boost over there at the bottom. So discovery stat below is 110, and the scaling seems to be very similar to the Luck one in Dark Souls 3. So my bet is it has something to do with that. Now, obviously, this isn't where it all stops. As I've said, this game also features dungeons, and when you're out there exploring, you can find a whole range of caves, mines, catacombs, and also dungeons out there that will be pretty much filled with dangers and a lot of secrets, but also treasures and bosses. And we also saw some of the familiar From Software formula again in some of these areas. We saw the invisible walls. They are pretty much back, so you just hit them and they reveal the secret area behind them. And there's also enemy ambushes, so definitely pay close attention, especially to some of those dark corners, and you will definitely want to carry one of those torches to light areas up, unless you want to get backstabbed yourself. But we saw one of these dungeons right here, a really awesome Storvale Castle. It's a first look at one of the larger scale dungeons that again you can find seamlessly when out there doing exploration. And it seems to be one of the bigger areas that you can go ahead and explore, featuring multiple types of enemies and also some of these bosses. Now, what's cool in this aspect is the fact that if one entrance is overrun with enemies and you can't make your way inside, there's a way to find additional paths inside of the same area or castle, as there's multiple secret entrances that you can discover and go into and make your way up on top of like building roofs and kind of make your way inside to discover the paths ahead and some of the other cool stuff that you will find in these dungeons. Anyway, on a final note, as I've said, there are 6 zones in total in Elden Ring that are dominated by a demigod that you kind of eventually have to fight as the story brings you there. And we have a first look at one of them, which is Goldrick the Golden. He is the ruler of Stormvale and likely going to be one of our first encounters, I believe. Maybe even the first, not really exactly sure yet, but it definitely looks like the type of boss encounter that you're going to spend quite a bit of time into. Like, it has so many cool abilities that you have to be careful about, but likely the reward is going to be on the same scale too. And I think that From Software is just exceeding expectations with these boss designs right here and the encounters. So honestly, I cannot wait to see how the full game looks when it launches next year. Totally let me know down below which was your most loved feature in the reveal that we saw so far, which are the things that you're looking forward to the most. And if you want to stay tuned for everything else Elden Ring related, definitely make sure you stick around, and I'll see you guys in the next video.